Hello and welcome to Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. I'm the publisher of Earth911, and this is a new series on sustainability in your ear called One Person's Impact. And really, I want to tell you a story, a series of stories about how I am trying to make changes to be supportive of a livable atmosphere. A year ago, I got involved with Earth911, and I did it largely because I knew I was not making the kinds of changes I needed to in my life in order to support the environment. And so I got involved with Earth911 largely to learn about how to make progress. And as I've watched people make progress over the last year, myself and others included, I often see folks criticizing them for not going far enough. And I want to emphasize in this story the challenges that you can overcome if you just let go of being afraid of not going far enough or going too far for yourself. This is really a process of making new trade-offs in our lives, ones that are profoundly important to the future of our species and to our planet. But we also have to recognize that we're people, and changing people takes time and takes energy. So my efforts, my attempts to change began last year, and I've made what I consider small changes. I simply haven't done enough yet. But I started by getting rid of all of the gas-powered yard equipment I had. And this cost me about $650 to $700 last year. We got rid of the gas mower, we got rid of the gas blower, and the gas trimmer. And this year I wanted to do something much bigger, and that was getting a new electric vehicle. So, I was born in a time when the car was the way that you became free. You grew up, you got a car, and you started driving away from home, and that was the world. And unfortunately, I've always associated my car with a certain sense of freedom, and so I have kept a sports car much longer than it was a good idea to do so. And in fact, I think that's the challenge we all have. We want to stay the same. We want to keep the same status symbols that we think are important, but those status symbols obviously change over time. So I went out and I purchased a used BMW i3. It's a 2016 with a range extender, and it's a great car. I've had it for about a week and a half now, and it raised a couple of important issues for me. First was the concern that the range wasn't going to be good enough for my twice-weekly 60-mile commute each way. So essentially, I'm burning about I'm traveling about 220 miles a week, 240 miles a week, and burning about 62 gallons of gas a month, which when you do the math, I use E10 gas, ends up reducing the amount of carbon dioxide that my cars produce as I do that commute by 1,174.9 pounds per month, or about 14,000 pounds per year, roughly 7 tons of CO2 that I am not producing by driving to work anymore. And I think that's a great thing, and I think everybody ought to consider doing it. If you're not taking public transit and trying to cut your impact and sitting in an individual car, the electric vehicle is the way to go. The i3 is a ton of fun to drive. It handles much better than you would think it would because it has these very narrow, high wheels that surprisingly turn out to be the ultimate driving machine for getting around with an EV. But I also needed to deal with the expectations of my family and also my own sense of security. So first time that I drove to work, that 60-mile commute, I was wondering whether or not I'd make it even one way. And it turned out I did, with 12 miles left to spare on my electric engine. And on a second occasion this past week, since I got the car, I have had to drive an extra 50 miles during one of those commutes in order to give a talk at a Chamber of Commerce event. That meant that I had to drive about 95 miles without a charge, which was more than the car was guaranteed for. And then with the range-extending engine, which burns premium gas, there's a little 2-gallon gas tank and essentially a BMW motorcycle engine inside that sounds like an air conditioner when it starts to run. I was able to get that 93, 95-mile drive in with absolutely no problem. And so I've overcome this sense that the car, because it has a very limited range when you look at it on the dashboard, I've overcome the sense and know how to manage now what I can get out of the vehicle. But what is my difference? As I said, I'm getting rid of about 14,000 pounds of CO2 a year. And I can certainly add to that by carpooling with other people to reduce their emissions and also participate in other forms of conversion to electric, which I have yet to do, obviously. Now, why should one person make these changes? We all hear all the time that, you can't make a difference. Only people who have power or who are elected officials can make a difference. And that is very unfortunate. I think we are not sitting out here in the cheap seats. We're sitting out here in the seats that are in control of the economy, because ultimately we're the ones who decide what we want to buy and use. And unfortunately, we haven't been given the options for electric as long as we might have. There were electric cars 100 years ago. It's unfortunate that the gasoline-powered engine won out, but it did. And so here we are today with probably another 5 to 6 years to go before some really incredible new battery technology hits the market, and we're able to drive 50 miles with absolutely no thought as to whether or not the battery is going to wear out. Those electric vehicles in the 2025 range are going to be able to drive 300 to 500 miles on a charge. And I'm looking forward to that. But for the time being, a used BMW is a great way to go. Now, these cars do depreciate fairly quickly. The 2016 vehicle that I purchased sold new for about $54,000, and I got it for $26,000. And I also purchased an extended coverage plan for the battery. So essentially, my car is covered and will deliver the performance it currently does on a single charge until 2025. And if it falls below 80% of that, I can have those batteries replaced. The car, driving an i3 is also interesting because you get a lot of kudos from people. I happen to, put a little posting on Facebook, and I got back more than 100 congratulations, and I would call heartfelt thanks from people for making the effort to make this change. It's also true that when we're talking about this with friends here in town, they say the same thing. They're just wildly impressed. But it's been a bit of a challenge. Getting rid of a Cadillac sports car was unpleasant to me and my wife, and it caused some tension here in the house. So you need to be prepared not just to think about how you manage your driving, but also the responses of the people around you, both positive and indifferent. I wouldn't call it a negative response to the car, but certainly my daughter, who covets that Cadillac as an opportunity to drive in the future, is disappointed that it won't be there. Now, let's talk about some of the things that made that a good decision. I have power coverage or a power service from Tacoma Public Utilities, and this is a utility that is primarily hydropower driven. In fact, 84% of their power comes from hydro. Only 1.6% of Tacoma Public Utilities power comes from coal, which was my primary concern. I don't want to buy into a car that, even though it is electric, is ultimately using coal power to drive itself. So even though Tacoma Public Utilities has a little bit of nuclear, 6% as a source, which is less than the 7% that they currently get from wind power, I'm pretty comfortable that the utility, TPU, is giving me clean energy. The next step I could take to ensure that would be to move to a solar home, a completely solar-driven home, and essentially live off the grid on the power generated by panels on my roof. And that may be something that I'll be doing in the next couple of years. However, it's a very significant investment to do so, and we've talked about that on some of the other podcasts and certainly in many articles on Earth911. So if you want to know more about how to add energy, add solar power to your roof, check out those articles. But we need to think really clearly about what the opportunity is to make a change. If 10% of American drivers, there's about 221 million drivers in the United States, were to switch over and do what I did, and that is get rid of roughly 14,000 pounds of emissions a year, which is actually a little low. Most people drive or commute 5 days a week, whereas I commute 2. So we'd actually be moving higher overall if everybody were to do this. But let's say just 10% did that. We'd be getting rid of about 155 million tons, or 3% of the CO2 produced by U.S. by the U.S. in total each year. 3% doesn't sound like much, but that's if only 10% of our drivers were to switch over. If 50% of our drivers did, then we're talking about something on the order of 20% of the total CO2 emitted by the United States. And that would start to make a significant difference because we're going to be bringing several new technologies online in conjunction with our use of electric vehicle or electric power for vehicles. And one of those is the ability to capture carbon and remove it from the atmosphere. So if we can begin to lower our emissions overall, as well as capture carbon and permanently sequester it rather than doing temporary offsets where you sell a power company the ability to buy back the right to pollute by purchasing carbon credits, but actually if we established a permanent sequestering model where when you pay for a carbon credit, it ends up in the ground and stays there or under the sea, we'd be in a much better position to move toward 2030 when we need to really begin to completely eliminate this CO2 sources as a driver of global temperature change. And by 2050, I believe, with carbon capture, the reduction of carbon emissions and the general transition from fossil fuel to electric, wind, solar, and other forms of electric power generation, we can be in a position to return the climate overall back to something similar to what our grandchildren had. We're at roughly 420 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere today. That is 120 to 150 million parts per 150 parts per million higher than it was at the beginning of the industrial era when it was about 220 parts per million CO2 in the overall atmosphere. So doing things like moving from gas-powered garden equipment is a tiny little thing, although two-stroke engines, which are common in those devices, are even more polluting than a regular car engine. Those small differences add up. Adding the car, adding solar for the house, which would eliminate other sources of coal-generated or nuclear-generated power that we consume, will make an even bigger difference. And, of course, we can cut other forms of consumption. But that car, that thing we get around in, is so thoroughly inculcated in the American identity of at least the 20th people born and raised in the 20th century, that it's going to be a challenge for a lot of people to let go. And I'm hoping if you hear this and understand the urgency of the situation, that you'll consider looking at one of these cars. Now, the i3, the performance is great, handles well, it goes as far as I've needed it to, and now that I've done some experimentation, I realize I could take this on a trip. The difference on those trips would be stopping for a fast charge for roughly 25 minutes to an hour, or a long charge of up to 3 to 4 hours in order to keep going. Now, when you're planning a vacation, that's a very different thing than driving straight across a state or straight to Los Angeles from San Francisco or from New York to Washington, D.C. You're going to have to build in pauses. But that may be the kind of vacation we really all need, is one where we're not in a rush to get somewhere, but that we're on a journey with the ability to stop and appreciate the things around us. So it's not so bad. It still is that form of mobile freedom that we all covet in this country. Now, you may be thinking, well, give up the freedom. Well, I may have to die in order for me to do that. And many people are going to hold on to the things that they were familiar with, such as the freedom of mobility that came with the sheer happenstance and luck of being born in America in the late 20th century. That is the nature of change. Generations come and go. And I'm astonished at the awareness and the brilliant concern that young people have about the environment that they're growing up into. We need to help them by making some of these changes, even though they are uncomfortable. So I gave up a sports car, but I got an i3, and it's a BMW. It's used, and I think a lot of people should consider looking at used electric vehicles as their first step, maybe use it as an augmentation to their current transportation modes instead of simply looking at it as a pure replacement. And we should all learn to step back from the things that we take for granted, like mobile freedom, and think about how we can trade off the right things. So I gave up gas. I gave up a lot of oil that spills on the road from a car, and in fact, a single quart of oil that leaks out of a car over the course of its life can pollute up to 1 million gallons of water. So that's a big change. So what does one person's difference make? Well, when you make a difference of 14,000 tons of carbon over the course of a year, I think you can pat yourself on the back. I'm not satisfied with the progress I've made completely, but I have made a step in the right direction. And I hope that you'll join me in thinking about how you can do the same. So this is Sustainability in Your Ear. It's the first of our One Person's Impact series. We'll be asking others to talk about this as well. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth911, and we'll be talking to you soon. Take care.